Why Cain still matters today. We hear his name and think of murder, rejection, punishment. But Cain's story is far more human than we like to admit. He was the firstborn of humanity, raised with the knowledge of God, yet unable to escape the weight of comparison, emotion, and choice. His fall wasn't instant, it was gradual. Like so many today, Cain didn't curse God. He just let resentment grow. He believed in God's existence. He even brought him an offering. But he misunderstood the heart behind it. He did what many of us do. He came close, but not surrendered. And when things fell apart, he fled. Marked, but not destroyed. Cursed, but still alive. He built cities, had children, and shaped culture. He invented, created, led. From the outside, it looked like success. But internally, there was exile. A distance from God that couldn't be filled with productivity or pride. That's where so many live today. Not in outright rebellion, but in quiet wandering. They don't hate God. They just don't know how to come back. Cain reminds us that sometimes sin doesn't look like evil. It looks like drifting. And the scariest part? He never returned. But what if he had? What if Cain had fallen at the altar he once avoided and said, "I'm sorry"? Would God have restored him? The answer is yes. And that answer still stands today. Because there are millions with Cain's heart, broken, bitter, or just busy, who long to be found. Cain's story isn't just ancient tragedy. It's a mirror. It's a warning. But more than that, it's a call. A call to those who've wandered too long and deep down want to come home. The story of Cain still matters because grace is still waiting. The marked man. Who was Cain, really? He was the firstborn of humanity, the first child born after Eden, the first man to open his eyes outside of paradise. Cain wasn't just a character, he was history's first experiment in life after the fall. Raised by parents who once walked with God but now labored in dust and shame. He was the first to hear about the garden, but never see it. Imagine growing up with the knowledge that perfection once existed, but you missed it. Cain carried the weight of a lost world. Yet Cain was not a monster. He worked the ground, he brought an offering, he believed in something greater. But his offering lacked heart, it lacked obedience. His brother Abel brought the best, Cain brought what was convenient. And when God favored Abel's sacrifice, something broke in Cain. Envy twisted into anger. That anger became violence. And just like that, the first murder was born. Not out of hatred for God, but out of wounded pride and jealousy. Cain didn't just kill his brother. He killed his own peace. But the most chilling moment wasn't the murder. It was after. When God asked, "Where is your brother?" and Cain replied, "Am I my brother's keeper?" A sarcastic, cold reply from a man who just buried his blood in the earth. And still, God didn't kill him. He marked him. Not with condemnation, but with protection. A symbol of mercy and justice at war. Cain becomes the blueprint for the conflicted human heart, capable of worship and wrath, potential and destruction. His life forces us to ask, what do we do when God doesn't respond the way we want? Do we return, or do we run? Did Cain have children? The line of a murderer. Yes, Cain had children, and not just one. Genesis 4:17 tells us that Cain knew his wife, and she bore him a son named Enoch. Cain then built a city and named it after that son. The murderer became a builder, the exile became a founder. His blood-stained hands now shaped civilizations. His descendants didn't hide in shame. They multiplied, invented, and advanced. The line of Cain became the first architects, musicians, metalworkers. Culture exploded, but so did corruption. Names emerge in Cain's lineage: Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, and Lamech, each one echoing deeper into history. But the legacy turns darker with Lamech, a man who not only practiced polygamy but boasted of killing. He declared, "If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. What began as exile ended in arrogance. The spirit of Cain had multiplied, not just biologically, but spiritually. Violence didn't end with him. It evolved, it became normalized, celebrated. Lamech wore it like a badge. But the Bible doesn't record these names to entertain. It's showing a pattern, a cursed line prospering outwardly, but crumbling inwardly. These weren't pagans in a distant land. They were descendants of the first man, of Adam, of those who knew the stories of Eden firsthand. And yet they built lives without the presence of God. They advanced the world and abandoned its maker. Cain's children proved that fruitfulness isn't always faithfulness. And even today, cities are built, names are passed down, legacies formed. But the question remains, what good is it to build a world if your soul remains exiled? The woman without a name. Who was Cain's wife? She appears briefly, only one verse. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. No name, no genealogy, no introduction. Her silence has stirred centuries of debate. If Cain was among the first children of Adam and Eve, who was this woman? The most consistent biblical explanation is that she was his sister or niece, one of Adam and Eve's unnamed children. Genesis 5:4 says Adam had other sons and daughters. In the earliest generations, sibling unions were not rebellion. They were necessity. In a world without genetic decay or law, family was the only option for reproduction. This woman lived in exile. Her husband bore the mark of the world's first murder. She gave birth to Enoch, not in Eden but east of it, in the land of wandering. She helped raise a family and build a city, all while the memory of paradise loomed just behind them. Though scripture gives her no voice, her presence says much. She was part of the world's second beginning, one built not from innocence, but from aftermath. Her womb carried history forward when it could have ended in shame. Her name may be lost to us, but not to heaven. She represents the unseen matriarchs who built legacies in silence. Through her, God allowed the human story to continue, flawed, marked, and yet undeniably alive. She reminds us that even in broken beginnings, life persists. She bore not just children, but the weight of history. And though she walked with a man marked by failure, she carried a future in her arms. Sometimes the most significant people in the story are the ones whose names we never learn. Sons and daughters, the other children of Adam and Eve. Most people know Cain, Abel, and Seth, but the Bible hints at a much larger family. Genesis 5:4 says, Adam lived 800 years after he fathered Seth, and he had other sons and daughters. This simple statement opens a world of possibility. Adam and Eve didn't just raise 3 sons, they raised a population. Sons who hunted, daughters who gathered, children who formed clans and filled the earth. Though their names are lost, their impact was not. They were the mothers and fathers of early civilization, nations birthed from a single fallen couple. The beginning of humanity was larger than we imagine. These unnamed children likely lived hundreds of years like their parents. They would have had dozens, even hundreds of offspring. And from them came the early peoples that built, wandered, settled, and multiplied. While Cain's line gets attention, these other sons and daughters likely married each other, spreading Adam's bloodline throughout the earth. They knew of Eden, of the serpent, of the fall, and they passed it down through story, tradition, and warning. We often imagine ancient history as sparse, but it was likely a booming network of extended family, linked by faith, failure, and survival. But why did God only highlight a few names? Because Scripture doesn't aim to satisfy curiosity. It reveals purpose. The focus isn't quantity but covenant. The chosen line, the redemptive thread, runs through specific names. Yet every child mattered. Every life was part of the unfolding drama of redemption. These forgotten sons and daughters remind us that not being mentioned doesn't mean not being known. Heaven saw them. God breathed life into them, and their obedience, or disobedience, shaped the foundation of our world. Their silence in the Bible speaks. You don't have to be named to be part of the story. Could Cain have married his sister? The question feels uncomfortable, even disturbing by today's standards. Could Cain have married his sister? The short answer, biblically and historically, is yes. In the beginning, there were no other humans outside of Adam and Eve's children. Genesis 5:4 confirms they had other sons and daughters, and Cain's wife would have come from among them. There were no divine laws against such unions at the time, and no evidence of genetic defects. In a world just beginning, this was not sin, it was survival. The line had to continue. The human story had to start somewhere. Modern ethics recoil at the idea, but Scripture operates from context. The moral code we have today developed gradually, as God shaped civilization through law and covenant. The command against incest came much later, in Leviticus, during the time of Moses. By then, genetic degradation made such relationships harmful, but in the pristine generations after Eden, the DNA was strong, unbroken, unmarred by generations of mutation. What we see as moral confusion, they saw as obedience to multiply and fill the earth. What's more important is not the how, but the why. God allowed what was necessary in the beginning to fulfill his greater purpose: life. Cain's marriage to a sister may offend modern minds, but it fulfilled divine intention. And it reminds us that God works within history, even when it looks messy. Sometimes beginnings are uncomfortable. Sometimes obedience looks strange. But from that union, flawed as it seems, came cities, cultures, and generations. It wasn't about romance. It was about redemption through continuity. And sometimes, to understand Scripture, we must view it through eternity's eyes, not our own. Were there other humans outside Eden? One of the most mysterious verses in Genesis comes after Cain is cursed. He says to God, "Whoever finds me will kill me." But who was out there? If only Adam, Eve, and their children existed, who was Cain afraid of? This has led some to suggest there were other humans outside Eden, beings not descended from Adam and Eve. It's a provocative idea, but Scripture doesn't explicitly support it. Most likely, Cain feared retaliation from his own extended family, other sons or grandsons of Adam. Still, the question lingers: was humanity's story bigger than Genesis tells? Some ancient theories propose the existence of pre-Adamic races, humans created before Adam or in parallel. These ideas try to reconcile archaeology, genetics, and Scripture, but they stretch beyond the biblical text and lead to more questions than answers. The Bible presents Adam as the first man, formed by God's hands, into whom life was breathed. From him came all others. If there were other humans, they're not part of God's redemptive narrative. The focus is covenant, not chronology. The Bible's silence doesn't always mean exclusion. It means emphasis. What Cain's fear does reveal is this: human community had already expanded. Whether through brothers, cousins, or clans, Cain knew others existed, and that violence bred vengeance. His cry wasn't illogical, it was emotional. A guilty man afraid of justice, and in that fear, God marked him, not to shame him, but to protect him. That mark tells us something profound. Even when humans don't understand the full picture, God does. Whether or not others existed outside Eden, the truth remains. God was still in control of the story. Giants, Nephilim, and ancient bloodlines. Just a few chapters after Cain's story, Genesis introduces a shocking twist. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. These mysterious beings, called giants, fallen ones, or mighty men, have puzzled scholars for centuries. Genesis 6 says they appeared when the sons of God took human women as wives. Were these fallen angels? Were they powerful rulers? Whatever they were, their offspring shook the world. They weren't just tall, they were violent, dominant, and spiritually corrupt. The world had changed. And Cain's bloodline may have intersected with this shadowy realm. Some believe the Nephilim were hybrids, part divine, part human. If so, This would explain the rise of ancient mythology, superhuman kings, and early civilizations obsessed with gods and giants. The Bible doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us enough to see that something unnatural was happening, a corruption of God's design. Humanity was spiraling, not just morally, but biologically, and in the midst of it, God saw that the thoughts of man were only evil continually. The Nephilim weren't just a threat to humanity, they were a threat to the promise. That's why God sent the flood, not just to cleanse sin, but to preserve the seed, a pure line, a way forward. These ancient giants represent the dangers of compromise, when heaven's boundaries are ignored and flesh follows forbidden desire. Cain's legacy may not have directly created them, but the pattern of rebellion he started helped open the door. The Nephilim remind us that evil doesn't just grow, it mutates, and in every generation we face the same decision. Will we guard what is holy, or mingle with what destroys? Theology and shock, what it means for humanity. The story of Cain, his wife, his children, and the Nephilim raises deep theological questions. If humanity began with Adam and Eve, how do we explain Cain's fear of others, or the rise of powerful beings like the Nephilim? These aren't just historical puzzles, they shake how we understand sin, salvation, and human identity. Some wonder, were there other human lines outside the garden? If so, what does that mean for the doctrine of original sin? Did they fall too? Or was the world already broken before the fall spread through Adam? Biblical theology centers on this. Adam was the first man, and through him, sin entered the world. Romans 5:12 is clear. Through one man, sin entered. That means all who sin are connected to Adam. Theories of other races or people might intrigue the imagination, but they drift from the redemptive arc. The Bible isn't a science book, it's a salvation story. Its goal isn't to map population growth, but to trace a covenant. And that covenant passes through a chosen line, not a perfect one, but one preserved by God for redemption. In the end, these mysteries remind us that faith is not built on full understanding, but on trust. We weren't meant to know everything. We were meant to walk with the one who does. The strange details, the unnamed figures, the ancient bloodlines, all of it points to one truth: the world needs saving. And from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Christ, God has never stopped writing that rescue plan. The deeper you dig, the more you see. Scripture isn't afraid of complexity. It invites us to see beyond it into the heart of a God who redeems broken beginnings. Cain's legacy, sin, exile, and the search for redemption. Cain's story doesn't end with a grave, it ends with a mark, a symbol of both judgment and mercy. He walked the earth with blood on his hands and a curse on his name, but God didn't erase him. He let him live. That paradox is Cain's legacy, the tension between sin and grace. He represents every soul that has wandered too far, done too much, or fallen too deeply, and still finds themselves alive. Not because they earned mercy, but because God still has more to say. Cain's punishment wasn't death, it was distance. And that distance still echoes today. We live in a world of exile, spiritual, emotional, moral. Like Cain, many keep building cities, legacies, and names, all while carrying invisible wounds. Some try to escape their guilt with noise, progress, or distraction. Others just stop feeling altogether. But even in exile, God still speaks. He still marks, not to destroy, but to protect what might one day return. Cain's life is a warning, yes, but it's also a whisper. You haven't gone too far. His story teaches us that the worst thing you've done doesn't have to be the last chapter. Redemption was always available. Cain just never took it, but you still can. The search for redemption isn't about reversing the past. It's about surrendering the future. You may feel far, forgotten, or marked by failure, but you're not alone. The God who heard Abel's blood still hears your prayers, and the story that began with exile can still end with home. Cain's legacy doesn't have to be yours, because where he stopped running, you can start returning.